The story begins the way dusk unfurls over an old western sky, slow, patient, as though the sun itself is reluctant to leave the world behind. The light settles in soft copper streaks across the tall grass, brushing every blade with a tired warmth. In that hour, when the land seems to hold its breath between day and night, a lone man would walk a narrow dirt path, his shadow long and wavering behind him. His name was Elias Mercer. If you had ever seen him, truly seen him, you'd remember the way his shoulders carried more years than his face would admit, and the way his boots moved with the rhythm of someone who had walked the same road so many times that the earth itself knew him. In his right hand, the old tin pail swung with a gentle clink at each step. He never missed a day. 20 years, and not once did he fail to carry supper into the hills. Most men carried rifles into those hills. Elias carried food. Folks talked about him in hushed tones around bar counters and dusty porches. They wondered what business a man had wandering out at dusk with nothing but supper and silence as company. Some said he was feeding his spirit. Others claimed he'd gone soft in the head. A few believed he was hiding a woman, though none could say what kind. But the truth, they couldn't have imagined. The hills knew, and the one he fed knew. Her name was Nalin, a name the wind treated tenderly. A name Elias wouldn't speak for a long, long time. Before the world tied them together, Elias had been a young man shaped by hard land and harder people. He grew up under the heavy quiet of a father who spoke through expectations rather than words. That kind of upbringing carves silence into a person's bones. It teaches them to listen more than they speak, to watch more than they ask. Elias became that sort of man, steady, dependable, a little lonely, and not nearly as tough as folks thought he was. He was 23 this summer. He wandered deeper into the hills than he ever had reason to. A calf had broken through the fence during the night, leaving a trail of small, hopeful hoof prints in the dirt. The morning sun was still young, still soft, and Elias followed the tracks through sagebrush that smelled sharp and green beneath the heat. He moved steady, letting the hum of cicadas fill the quiet spaces in his thoughts. Near midday, he reached a canyon mouth where shadows pooled like cool water. The air shifted, subtle, but enough that he stopped. The land carries its own kind of language, especially in the West. It warns you when you're being watched, and Elias felt it. Not danger, but presence. He turned slowly, the way a man does when his instincts whisper caution, but not fear. At first, he thought a boulder had moved. A massive silhouette stood between two slabs of stone, tall enough to eclipse sunlight. It didn't shift, didn't breathe loud, didn't retreat. It simply existed in the stillness, as though carved from the canyon wall itself. Then the shape stepped forward. Elias' breath snagged in his throat. Not from terror, but from the shock of seeing something the world never told him existed. She was enormous, not in a way that distorted her into legend or nightmare. No, she was human, unmistakably so, but built on a scale that defied expectation. Her shoulders broad, her height towering, her hands large enough to cradle a grown man's face like a child's. Long dark braids framed her features, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, held a depth no language could touch easily. But what struck Elias wasn't her size. It wasn't the strangeness of finding such a person hidden among rocks and pine. It was the fear, a quiet, bone-deep fear shining in her gaze. Fear of him, fear of being seen, fear of what seeing might lead to. Her whole body was coiled like a deer ready to flee, though she didn't run. She just watched him as if waiting to be hurt. Elias did not move for a long moment. He felt something inside him soften, as though the land itself placed a hand over his heart and urged him to be gentle. Slowly, so slowly even the wind seemed to pause, he reached into his saddlebag. Her eyes widened, tension sharpening across her shoulders. Elias lifted both hands slightly to show he carried no weapon, no threat. Then, from the bag, he pulled nothing more than a piece of cornbread left from his lunch. He placed down a flat stone between them, not as offering, not as apology, as understanding, a silent message. I see you. I don't fear you. I won't harm you. He backed away one step at a time, letting her see every movement. When he had moved far enough down the slope, the shadowed woman stepped forward. She did not look at him. She looked at the cornbread, touched it with 2 fingers, and lifted it as if unsure whether she deserved such a simple kindness. Elias left her there, the way one leaves a fragile truth undisturbed. All that day, and all through the night, he could not shake the image of her, lonely, frightened, enormous in body yet curled inward like a forgotten child. He returned the next evening with more food. He told himself it was foolish, that he had better things to do, that a stranger like her had no place in his life, nor he in hers. But he still returned. The second evening she stood farther back, half hidden behind tall pines. He set the food down and spoke softly into the open air, not expecting a response, just letting his voice reach her like a hand extended across distance. He told the hills about the calf he'd found, about the broken fence, about the heat and the dust, and how summer was wearing him thin. He did not look directly at her when he spoke. Something told him she needed the space. Each day, after unfolded like this, Elias bringing food, and words, and her bringing silence, and presence. Over time, she began leaving small things behind as if to answer him without speaking directly. A polished river stone placed where he left the food, a carved wooden bird, a bundle of dried herbs he recognized from his mother's stories. These are not gifts exactly. They were acknowledgments, ripples of trust, quiet but clear. He still hadn't heard her voice. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he felt her loneliness like a second heartbeat beside his own. Sometimes he'd catch her studying him from a distance, her expression unreadable but never hostile. It was as though she was trying to understand how a man could look at her without flinching. Elias understood something too. There are some souls the world pushes into shadows, and some souls who wander into those shadows because they have nowhere else to go. He had spent his life feeling like a man half seen. Perhaps she felt the same. The days stretched into weeks, weeks into a season, and before long, Elias no longer asked himself why he returned each evening. The hills had become a place where silence felt like company instead of emptiness. Sometimes the greatest kindness is found in the quiet between 2 people, the space where neither asks for explanation, yet both feel understood. That was what they shared, long before they knew each other's names. Time passed the way wind passes over prairie grass, quietly shaping everything without asking permission. The world changed around Elias Mercer, but his footsteps into the hills remained the one constant he carried through every season of his life. 20 winters, 20 summers, 20 years of sunsets poured like honey over the ridge while he walked the same path with that old tin pail swinging from his hand. When the snow came, it softened the edges of the hills until they looked like sleeping giants. When spring stretched its warm fingers across the land, green shoots pushed through the earth as though life itself refused to give up. Elias felt himself aging in the rhythm of these seasons, his beard turning silver strand by strand, his hands growing more lined, his gait a little slower each year. Yet what drew him to the hills never faded. She was always there. Sometimes he saw only a shadow moving behind the tree line, sometimes just the faint outline of her towering figure against the setting sun. Sometimes she sat on the high ledges above him, legs dangling, watching him the way a mountain watches a wanderer. She never came too close. He never asked her to. Trust, for her, was not something that bloomed easily. It grew like desert flowers, only after long drought, only after rare rain. Elias talked more than she did, though his talking was never loud. He spoke the way a man speaks to the night sky, words floating upward and dissolving into the air. He told her about the ranch, about his stubborn mare who refused to let anyone but him saddle her, about the ranch hands who drank too much on weekends, about the way the world felt heavier each year, though he never admitted the loneliness that pushed against his ribs like a restless animal. She listened, always listened, and in her silence, Elias felt seen. Not judged, not measured, just seen. There were moments when he caught her trying to understand his habits, the strange little rituals humans cling to. When he prayed before eating, she tilted her head as if the gesture fascinated her. When he laughed softly at his own stories, her eyes flickered with a warmth he didn't know she carried. When he looked sad and tried to hide it, she seemed to tuck her chin deeper in her chest, as if she too felt the heaviness of whatever weighed him down. They never named their connection, and maybe that was what made it pure. It was not friendship, not romance, not anything the world had words for. It was a kind of peaceful witnessing, two souls sharing the same quiet without asking the other to be different. Years carved themselves into the land and into Elias' life. He married once during that long span, though the marriage lasted only a few years. His wife, a restless woman named Clara, said he lived too much in his mind and in the hills, and not enough in the world she wanted to build. Elias tried. Lord knows he tried, but some hearts beat to the rhythm of land and wind rather than homes and crowds. When Clara left, she didn't even take the wagon. She simply walked away from their small house one morning, leaving behind a pair of gloves, a half-written letter, and the kind of silence that takes months to sweep out. Elias didn't run after her. He just stood in the doorway, watching her fade into distance like a memory returning to wherever it came from. That evening, he carried food into the hills. He didn't speak for a long time. She didn't move for a long time, but she stepped a little closer that day, close enough that he could see the trembling rise and fall of her breath, close enough that her shadow brushed his. This is how people heal sometimes, not through words, but through the simple knowing that someone stayed. As the years folded into each other, Elias learned small truths about her without ever forcing her to reveal them. He could tell when she was tired. He could hear it in the heaviness of her movements, in the way she sank into the earth after a long day, lowering herself carefully like someone carrying old wounds and old bones. He knew she preferred winter over summer because the cold was kinder to her joints. He learned she liked to sit where the moonlight touched her hands. He watched how she lingered just a moment when he left, as if waiting to make sure he reached the trail safely. But the deeper truths, the ones that carve her silence, came slowly, like stones rising from the earth one rainstorm at a time. Elias began to notice scars. Long, pale lines along her arms, faded marks on her back, a deep groove near her collarbone. Not the kind made by accidents, but the kind left behind by steel, by violence, by people. He never asked. Not until the day she gave him permission without a word. It was early autumn, the air gold with falling leaves. Elias found her sitting on a rock, her face turned toward the distant hills. She didn't move when he approached, which was unusual. She always shifted, always kept a slight distance. That stillness told him something fragile was resting on the moment. He sat down beside her carefully, not close enough to touch, but close enough that it felt shared. They stayed like that, listening to wind slipping between branches, until she lowered her gaze to her hands. Then she turned one palm upward, a gesture, an offering. And for the first time, he saw the full story written across her skin. Not the whole story, but enough. He understood without her saying a word. Humans had hurt her. Not creatures from folklore, not animals from the mountains, humans. People who feared what they didn't understand. People who wanted to control what they couldn't. People who saw her difference as a threat rather than a wonder. Elias felt something in him tighten, a slow-burn anger he rarely let himself feel. But he breathed it out. Anger would only remind her of what the world taught her to fear. Instead, he let his hand hover above hers, not touching, just near. Close enough to say, "I'm here. I'm not like them. You are safe." She blinked once, a small, heavy blink, as if releasing a weight she had carried for too long. Her breath shuddered through her chest, and Elias realized she wasn't just afraid of people. She was afraid of being known by them, because being known meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability had never been kind to her. The world outside the hills continued to chatter. Ranch hands whispered about strange shadows. Travelers told tales of a mountain giant roaming the woods. Young boys dared each other to explore the canyon after dark. Fear spread like frost over windows. Sheriff Boyd, a man with a jaw set harder than stone, started asking questions. "What's Mercer doing up there every night?" he muttered to the saloon crowd. "No man goes wandering with food, unless he's feeding something worth fearing. He had a way of turning suspicion into certainty, and certainty into danger. Marjorie, Elias' sister, wrung her hands each time she saw him leave. "Someone's going to start talking, Eli," she warned. "People don't like mysteries." She wasn't wrong. People fear what doesn't fit inside the borders of their understanding. There was also Tobin, a young ranch boy who watched Elias with awe in his eyes. Tobin followed him once, just far enough to glimpse a massive shadow bending behind trees, and ran home breathless, half terrified, half enchanted. He said nothing, but the fear in his small, trembling body was loud enough to echo through the community. Rumors grew like weeds, tangled and stubborn. Elias felt the shift. The land changes before people do, but people always follow eventually. He began walking to the hills earlier, taking different paths, watching the horizon more closely. The world he and Nalin had quietly built, the world made of small shared comforts, was becoming thinner, more fragile. Still, he did not stop going. Still, she waited for him, and in the quiet where they met, where the world softened around the two of them, Elias understood something deeper with every passing day. She wasn't hiding because she was dangerous. She was hiding because the world was. And soon, that world would come searching. The hills held their breath as the years folded into themselves, carrying Elias and Nalin through a quiet companionship no one else could understand. But even in that silence, the weight of the world outside the hills began to press in, carrying questions, rumors, and shadows that could not be ignored forever. Elias had always known that one day the world might step over the horizon, drawn by curiosity or fear, but he had not anticipated the urgency with which it would arrive. It began on an early autumn evening. The wind carried a chill that hinted at the coming winter, and the sun poured gold across the high ridges, turning everything into soft fire. Elias set the tin pail down beside a rock where he often left it, glancing around as if expecting her shadow to appear. She was there, taller than ever, her presence framed by the fading light. He sat quietly, watching her, letting the silence stretch, comfortable and unforced. She didn't speak. She rarely did. Not because she could not, but because words were heavy things, and she had learned long ago how cruel they could be. Elias had waited long enough. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and spoke softly, letting the words fall like petals in the wind. "I've been walking this path for a long time," he said. "And I've been thinking you've never told me why you never come closer, why you hide." For the first time in 20 years, she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were pools of shadow and amber, holding the weight of centuries in their depths. Her voice came, soft as a whisper over dry leaves, almost swallowed by the wind. "The world fears what does not bow its head," she said. Elias' chest tightened. He felt the words resonate in him, in the quiet places where his own loneliness and fear had taken root. She was not speaking of him, not exactly. She was speaking of everything she had carried since she was a child. The fear, the loss, the weight of living in a world that had never truly seen her. And then she began, slowly, allowing pieces of her life to unfurl like smoke. She had been born different, larger than anyone in her Apache band, and that difference had marked her from the start. Villagers whispered of curses and giants, of spirits that walked too tall for the earth, and soldiers came to capture, to test, to destroy. She had fled, surviving by hiding, living in the hills where no one could touch her. Her family had been taken, scattered, erased from the world she loved. Her scars were not just physical, but woven into her very being. Every step she took in the open carried the memory of fear. And now, after 2 decades of isolation, she had begun to trust Elias. Not with her life yet, but with her story, with the fragments of it. Elias listened. He did not interrupt. He could not. Each revelation landed in his chest, heavy and precise, and yet he did not shrink from it. He wanted to hold it, to carry it with her. That was the difference between him and the world that had hurt her. He did not see her fear as something to conquer. He saw it as something to honor. It was in that stillness that he began to understand the truth of what she had been protecting all these years. Not herself, not simply her life, but something sacred. She had been guarding the burial grounds of her people, sacred earth that held the bones and stories of generations. A promise made to her mother had shaped her every step. She feared the world would come and plunder, would disrespect, would destroy. He finally saw her as she was. Not monstrous, not mythical, not dangerous, but a guardian, a keeper of memories, a silent protector. Elias felt a quiet awe. He realized that the food he had been bringing, the company he had offered, had never been just nourishment. She had been accepting trust, the kind of trust the world had never granted her. And in doing so, she had been teaching him too, how to witness without judgment, how to give without expectation, how to honor the fragility of someone who has survived a lifetime of fear. But peace, as always, is fragile. On the ridge above them, the sun caught a glint of metal. A rifle, pointed not at game, not at the wind, but at the hidden world Elias and Nalin had nurtured for 20 years. Sheriff Boyd and a small party of men were moving carefully, speaking in low tones. They had heard the rumors, followed the whispers, and now they wanted proof. They did not come for understanding. They came for control. Elias felt the ground tighten beneath him. He rose slowly, keeping his hands visible. Nalin tensed, towering beside him, but she did not retreat. This was the moment she had feared most. Yet something in Elias' steady gaze gave her courage. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and the approaching men. "Wait," he said, voice low and firm. "She is not what you think." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He had seen enough to know fear when it whispered in the back of his mind. But Elias' calmness, his unwavering presence, forced him to hesitate. There was something about this man, something deeper than mere words or law, a quiet truth that demanded attention. Nalin's head tilted slightly, her eyes catching the fading light. She did not move, though her muscles coiled with readiness. Elias spoke again, slowly, softly, revealing the essence of what he had carried for her, the story of her life, the kindness she had offered to him without expectation, the trust she had extended despite fear. Some of the men lowered their rifles, unsure what to make of this revelation. Others did not. The tension of decades pressed down on the hills, as if the earth itself waited to exhale. At that moment, the hills seemed to lean in closer, holding its breath. And then, like a spirit answering a silent call, an elder appeared. Tahoma, an old man whose eyes held the knowledge of years and the weight of forgotten truths. He had come quietly, moving through the rocks and pine as though part of the land itself. Tahoma spoke not with anger, but with authority, reminding the men that treaties, promises, and sacred duty existed long before their rifles, long before their fear. He spoke of respect, of heritage, of the honor owed to those who protected what should never be stolen. His presence calmed some and chastened others. Elias turned to Nalin. She took a step forward, not in aggression, but in a gesture of quiet strength. She was not a threat. She was a sentinel. Her fear of the world had not vanished, but in this moment, she had allies, one who had never judged, and an elder who understood. The sheriff exhaled slowly, the gun lowering in his hands. One by one, the others followed. The tension that had pressed like iron across the hills began to dissipate. The earth itself seemed to relax. The sun dipped lower, painting the scene in shades of gold and fire, as if blessing what had just transpired. Elias placed a hand near Nalin, careful to honor the space she had always kept. He did not touch her, not yet. He simply acknowledged her courage, the weight she had carried for so long, and the trust she had given him. She returned the gesture with a tilt of her head, a silent acknowledgement that the hills were still hers, and that she was not alone. For the first time, the world outside did not feel like a threat. For the first time, Elias understood that the years of quiet companionship, the patience, the food left at her rock, the words whispered into the wind, all of it, had prepared them for this delicate balance between fear and understanding, between seeing and being seen. The men turned back toward the valley, leaving the hills to their guardians. The sun slipped behind the ridges, and the air cooled with the promise of night. Elias and Nalin stood together for a long while, not speaking, not needing to. The bond of 20 years was strong enough to fill the silence. And in that silence, Elias knew this was not the end of her story, nor of his. But it was the beginning of something quieter and stronger than either had ever known. The hills had chosen its own way to reveal the truth, and they had survived the gaze of the world because someone had chosen patience, kindness, and understanding over judgment and fear. As night fell, the first stars appearing like silver pins on a deep blue blanket, Elias took out his tin pail and left a small offering by the rock. She did not need it now, not in the way she had before, but it was his gesture, a reminder of the simple, quiet love that had grown between them. And Nalin, towering and powerful, turned her gaze toward the horizon, letting the wind brush her hair across her shoulders. She had faced the world and found that it could not break her, not entirely. And perhaps for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that there were people in it who might one day see her for what she truly was, not what they feared her to be. The hills were still, the air was calm, and the bond between the man and the giant woman, forged over 2 decades of silent care, had become something unshakable, a quiet testament to patience, trust, and the slow, enduring work of seeing each other fully. The hills were quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that feels alive, as if the rocks themselves were holding their breath. The wind moved gently through the pines, carrying whispers of past seasons and old promises. Elias walked the familiar path with the tin pail, swinging lightly in his hand. But tonight, every step felt heavier, more urgent. He sensed the tension before he saw it, like the subtle tightening of the air when a storm is near. Above him, a glint of metal caught the last rays of the sun. Rifles, aimed, eyes sharp, hearts uncertain. Sheriff Boyd and his men had come back. The rumors of a mountain giant had drawn not only curiosity, but fear, and fear had teeth sharp enough to pierce mountains. Elias stopped and exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. There was only one way to face this, one way to protect the woman he had walked with for 20 years. Nalin emerged from the trees, her towering form unmistakable. She did not shrink. She did not flinch. Her eyes scanned the men, her chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. She could have fled, could have hidden behind the rocks as she always had, but she didn't. This time, the world would see her, not as a monster, not as a curiosity, but as what she truly was, a guardian, a protector, a soul too strong to be broken by fear. Elias stepped between her and the rifles, letting the men see his hands empty. "Wait," he said, voice low but firm. "She is not what you think. She has done nothing but protect what is sacred." Sheriff Boyd's jaw tightened. "You expect us to believe that?" he demanded. "After all these stories, all these disappearances?" "She has lived here quietly for 20 years, Elias said. "She never harmed anyone. She never stole anything. She has only survived because the world forced her into hiding. And I've been with her. I've watched her. I've learned the truth of her life. And now, if you open your eyes, you will see it too." A tense silence followed, broken only by the faint whisper of wind in the pines. The men shifted uneasily. Some glanced at each other, uncertain. Some still gripped their rifles, ready to act. But they could not look away. Elias' voice carried a weight that made them pause, a slow, steady gravity they could not ignore. Then, from the ridges above, a figure appeared, small, bent with age, moving as if carried by the hills themselves. Tahoma, the Apache elder, had arrived. He did not speak immediately. He simply surveyed the scene, his eyes scanning the rifles, the men, Elias, and the towering woman beside him. Then he spoke, voice calm, but carrying authority that silenced the hills. "You do not understand what you see," he said. "She is not a threat. She is a keeper of our ancestors' rest. She protects what we cannot protect ourselves." To harm her is to harm all that is sacred. Sheriff Boyd shifted his weight, glancing down at the ground. His men hesitated. Some lowered their rifles, unsure now of who the threat really was. Others still gripped their weapons, but the edge of certainty had dulled. They could feel it in the wind, in the quiet, watching hills, in the presence of Tahoma, and in the unwavering calm of Elias. Nalin's eyes softened slightly as she watched Elias. She did not move closer, but she did not retreat either. Her chest rose with a steady rhythm. Her hands relaxed at her sides. She understood now that she was not alone. That after 20 years of hiding, there was someone who had seen her, truly seen her, and who would not let the world crush her. Elias took a step forward. "She has trusted me," he said. "For 20 years, she has trusted me. And I promise you, she will not harm you. She only asks for the respect that every human deserves and the right to live without fear." A few of the men lowered their weapons fully. Sheriff Boyd's eyes softened slightly, though his jaw remained tense. His gaze met Elias, and for a moment, he saw not a man protecting a strange creature, but a man protecting something larger, something sacred and unseen, a truth that had waited decades for recognition. Nalin moved slowly, deliberately. She stepped into the open, tall and proud, not a figure to inspire fear but awe. She did not speak, and she did not need to. Her presence alone was testimony enough. The wind carried a faint whisper of the past, of ancestors watching, of the promises she had kept, of the life she had endured. It swirled around the men like a tangible force. Some of them lowered their heads in respect. Others remained rigid, caught between disbelief and the undeniable weight of truth. Sheriff Boyd exhaled, slowly, like a man shedding something he had held far too long. He lowered his rifle. "She is not what I thought," he admitted, voice quiet. "The world has taught me to fear things I do not understand. Perhaps I have been wrong." Elias nodded. He felt a release in his chest, the tension of decades of fear dissolving like mist in sunlight. He stepped back, giving Nalin the space she had always deserved, and she finally allowed herself to exhale, a long, quiet breath that seemed to carry the weight of the hills, of the wind, of everything she had carried alone. Then Tahoma stepped forward, resting a hand gently on Nalin's shoulder. "The hills are yours, child," he said. "You have kept your promise. You have honored your people. And now the world may know that some things are too sacred to destroy." The men began to step back, moving toward the valley with newfound respect, leaving the hills quiet once more. The sun dipped behind the ridges, spilling fire and gold across the landscape, painting the rocks and pines in colors that seemed too beautiful for words. Elias watched Nalin, her towering figure standing against the fading light, and he felt a deep, abiding peace. For the first time in 20 years, she did not hide. She did not crouch in the shadows. She stood openly, not because the world had accepted her, but because she had chosen to stand. And she had chosen to trust that Elias would protect her. He approached slowly, holding the tin pail, not as a gift of food, but as a symbol of their shared years, the small, quiet acts of care that had carried them to this moment. Nalin nodded, acknowledging him, a gesture of trust and gratitude. He did not reach to touch her, for he knew some bonds were stronger when held in respect, not possession. The hills exhaled in unison. The wind softened. Night spread like a blanket across the ridges, dotted with stars that seemed to shimmer just for them. And Elias realized that this was not the end. This was a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter where fear had been replaced with understanding, and where trust, once fragile, had grown into something enduring. He whispered to the wind, almost to himself, almost to her, "The world may never understand you, but I do, and I always will." Nalin turned her gaze toward the horizon, letting the wind brush across her hair, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small, private smile. She was free, not from the hills, not from her past, but free in the knowledge that she had been seen, recognized, and honored. Elias stayed with her a little longer, letting the night deepen around them. The tin pail was empty, but their hearts were full. He knew that the hills would continue to whisper their secrets, and that some things were meant to remain protected. But now he was part of that protection. Now he was a witness. Now he was a friend. And in the quiet, he spoke once more, this time to anyone who might listen, across the wind, across the years. Sometimes the world fears what it cannot understand. But kindness, patience, and trust, they can light even the darkest hills. They can teach even the loneliest souls to stand tall. The stars reflected in Nalin's eyes as the night wrapped the hills in velvet darkness. Elias knew he would return every evening, not just with food, but with stories, with presence, with the quiet love that had grown over 2 decades. And he knew that she, the hidden giant, would continue to watch, to guard, to live as fully as anyone deserved. The wind carried their story into the night, a tale of patience, courage, and the quiet power of seeing one another fully. And somewhere, in the hearts of all who listened, it left a truth simple and profound. The world is full of souls who hide because they have been misunderstood. And sometimes it only takes one gentle heart to bring them back into the light. Elias leaned against a rock, looking at Nalin one last time before he began the walk home. "Where are you watching from tonight?" he whispered, as if asking the audience themselves. And in the stillness, he knew that somewhere someone would hear the story and remember. To care, to notice, to protect is to live fully. The hills waited, patient as ever, and the night settled softly over the world, leaving behind the promise that some stories, once told, never fade.